Fintech Chatter Podcast, brought to you by Tier 1 People, the leaders in executive search for Fintech ventures.
Hello and welcome to Fintech Chatter, the podcast where I chat with Fintech leaders about their secrets to success. I'm Dexter Cousins, your host and the founder of Tier 1 People, the executive search firm dedicated to connecting high-growth Fintech companies with exceptional leadership talent. With a proven track record in placing top executives in mission-critical roles, Tier 1 People is trusted partner for many of the world's most recognizable Fintech brands. Today's guest is Tristan Dakin from Wise. Tristan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dexter.
This is your debut. It's been one we've been trying to has been in the making for some time. And I think true to the spirit of Wise, you've kind of quietly gone about doing your business and said, let's wait until we've got some significant things to talk about. And there's a lot to talk about. But before we go into that, could you maybe share with our listeners who don't know Wise a little bit about you and kind of the big problem that you solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So Wise is a payments technology business, I think is the best way to sort of describe us. So we are striving to build the best way for people and businesses to move money around the world. So, people that live internationally, businesses that operate on a global scale or want to expand internationally, we build products, and we've built products that enable them to do that really cheaply and conveniently and transparently. So we have a remittance product, Wise Transfer, and we have a multi-currency account, which allows people to send and spend and receive in different currencies wherever they are, and, use a debit card to make payments as well. I guess the problems we're trying to solve are probably twofold, to kind of basket them into two groups. So the listeners have probably heard of Swift. So for a long time, Swift was really the only mechanism for sending a payment cross-border or internationally. And essentially what Swift is it's a payment messaging system. It relies on a chain of correspondent banks. So when you send a payment from A to B, you might go through 5 different banks along the way, and each bank will take a fee and maybe hold the payment up for a little bit. So what you're left with is a customer experience where you don't know how much is going to arrive at the other end. You don't know when it's going to arrive. So we've really built infrastructure to sort of compete with that correspondent system. We want our payments to be instant and cheap and super transparent, so people know what they're paying for, when the payment's going to arrive, etc. And I guess the other problem we're trying to solve, which ties into that, is this problem of transparency. And for a long, long time, when people are doing these things, they don't really know what they're paying for. And there's this culture within financial services there has been historically of trying to charge as much as possible and charge fees as high as possible to make a profit. And we really want to change that around and let people know what they're paying for. And we want to make regulators and policymakers make sure and enforce that banks have to do the same and other financial services have to do the same. So we sort of try and walk the walk as much as talk the talk a little bit.
Yeah. As a consumer, I'm a big fan of your product. As a business owner, I'm a big fan of your product. I think my feeling is, as a business owner, it's a really underserved market, and to have something as slick as Wise, it's a breath of fresh air. But you've kind of gone beyond just the kind of, are you B2B and B2C, and you've also got a white label solution and Wise platform as well. In terms of, I guess, the kind of complexity of the problems that you're solving, could you just give us some, I guess, context around how difficult it actually is to move money around the world instantly?
Yeah.
And by instant, I think you guys have got under 20 seconds or less is what you would class as instant.
That's right. Yeah, that's the metric we use. There's a lot of things you have to do with a payment before you can allow it to go to another place. And so, we are trying to build technology that allows us to do that in real time, really quickly. So when we say instant, we say around 20 seconds. There's a lot of screening and reporting and regulatory compliance requirements that we need to do, and AML things that we need to do on a payment. Look, it's a super complex problem, and maybe that's the reason why, no one has really competed with this correspondent banking infrastructure in the past. So we've bitten off a lot to chew. We're slowly working through it, but how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, I guess. Like, we're trying to build a ubiquitous product experience globally, and maybe the best way to illustrate the complexity is, like, you think about when you open a bank account at like a traditional bank, it's a really hyper-localized experience. A really important thing in financial services is, and like a strict requirement is, we need to know who our customers are, and we need to verify who they are before they use our services. So if someone goes and signs up for a bank, that bank's only operating in that one market. It's a really narrow path to verification, right? There's one regulatory regime that they need to adhere to, and there's one set of rules to like meet in terms of knowing your customer and verifying who they are. We're onboarding millions of customers across hundreds of different countries and regulatory regimes and jurisdictions, and we're trying to create a ubiquitous product experience. There's infinite permutations that a customer can go through to reach final verification based on the different idiosyncratic requirements. So that's a really, really tough problem to solve, right? How do you do that in a way that's smooth and there's not too much friction in the process, and it means that it's the same for someone in one country as it is for the other, while still adhering to all the different regulatory regimes? So like that's one example, but yeah, it's a relatively complex problem.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things that I find as well is with a problem that is this complex, and I say this with, the utmost respect. Two dudes in Bondi ain't raising a couple of $1 million in seed capital isn't going to fix this problem, right? And when you kind of look at the scale of a business, the size of Wise, and the amount of money and time and resources that have been invested into continuing to evolve the Wise solution, it's kind of, it's a sobering thought, I think, for anybody who kind of has aspirations of building a startup and tackling this type of problem.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I guess like the way we've really thought about it is like, why does a payment or the messaging around a payment have to go through 5 different banks along the way?
Yeah.
And how do we cut out those middlemen? And so like maybe the sort of genesis of Wise, our two founders, Kristo and Taavet, they're both Estonian. We were founded in 2011, and Kristo and Taavet both lived in London. Taavet was getting paid in euros though, in Europe. Yeah. Taavet was in London. Kristo was also in London, but obviously getting paid in pounds. But Kristo had a mortgage in Estonia, which needed to be paid in euros. So, rather than Kristo go to the bank and convert his pounds at a bank rate into euros and send it for his mortgage payment, he said to Taavet, well, why don't you just pay my mortgage payment for me in the euros you already have in Europe? So it's just a domestic payment and no FX on it. And I'll just pay you back in pounds here, another domestic payment in London. And we can just agree on what that exchange rate we use is, which is just the mid-market rate that you can Google. And we won't have to pay any fees or exchange rate markups to banks along the way. And that was really like how we started and the genesis of the idea. And I guess when you zoom out, it's like, how do we make sure that as much as possible funds don't actually cross borders? So really what Wise is doing is just managing liquidity in different markets that we operate. And, an Australian customer sending a payment to the UK, for instance, what they're really doing is sending a local AUD payment to an AUD account. That comes to us instantly because of the infrastructure that we've built in Australia. And we then instantly pay out a payment in the UK in pounds from liquidity that we already have there. And that leg is instant as well. So when you sort of patch those two things together, you get this instant, other side of the world transfer experience, which is pretty cool for customers.
Awesome. No, it's talking about Australia. When did Wise launch in Oz?
So we launched in 2016, and we started just with our send money, or like that's our internal jargon for our remittance product. So like our A to B sending money product. In 2018, we bought our multi-currency account and debit card to Australia. We've grown a lot since then. I think last year we had almost 13 million active customers globally. We're moving about £30 billion in cross-border payments every quarter. So almost 60 billion Aussie. And we have a lot of money that customers are holding in Wise accounts all around the world as well. I think we have almost 14 billion pounds held in Wise accounts globally. Yeah. And then, as I said, like speaking back to that structure of managing liquidity, we have, as much as possible, we try and plug ourselves directly into like instant payment rails in the countries that we operate. So rather than relying on banking infrastructure, we just clear and settle all ourselves. And we have 5 of those connections now. And a big part of the future of Wise is building out more of those direct connections.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, certainly I've had a lot of conversations with founders where they've always acknowledged, I guess, the expertise of banks and financial institutions around treasury. How has Wise kind of made that kind of quantum leap from being a fintech that was kind of had solving a unique problem to the quantum leap of enterprise grade treasury, liquidity, risk, compliance? It's I say quantum leap, and I think it actually is.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's just necessitated out of I guess we're a bit of a victim of our own success in that regard. I like one interesting thing about, and I guess it speaks again to the way that we're scaling the product, and also the way we're approaching solving this problem of like cross-border infrastructure, is that we're in a unique position. And the way we think about it is, rather than have fragmented systems and processes and, treasury and finance in different parts of the world catering to specific market, we have centralized infrastructure, which is then deployed on a regional basis. So we're managing liquidity in different parts of the world. We have a central treasury and finance team that have like a top-down view of all our payouts and pay-ins and all our liquidity all around the world. And then it makes it like a much more comprehensive view for us to manage that on a global scale. And I think that's where we really drive our competitive advantage.
Yeah. Last year, I think I must have pitched for about 3 or 4 cross-border currency businesses looking to launch here in Oz. And I couldn't understand why. I thought, Australia is a good place, for innovation, but why all this interest? Then when I was at Singapore Fintech Festival in November, I was actually invited along to Wise Platform, had an event. And there was a stat that stunned me, which was, I think, Australia's number 5 or 6 in the world for outbound remittance in terms of volume and value.
Yeah.
I just could not get my head around that. I think it was higher than India.
Yeah, exactly. It's that stat is legitimate. Australia is a very important and interesting market. I mean, if anything, just due to our geographical, location and then proximity to Asia. We've run a balance of trade deficit since the 60s, and a lot of businesses and people in Australia need to send money home for whatever reasons, whether that's paying invoices for your business or we have such a large diaspora of different people and cultures that live in Australia that want to send money home on a regular basis. And so that makes the infrastructure extremely important, and it makes it really important that they can do that in a cheap and transparent way.
Yeah. What was your background prior to Wise, Tristan?
So I've worked in financial services my whole career, so 15 years now. I did commerce and finance at university, but I worked mainly at foreign exchange capacities, so a couple of different brokerages. I worked at a prime broker, and then eventually made my way to Wise. So I've sort of seen the full spectrum of the industry and all the good stuff and some of the bad stuff as well, which I guess has kind of led me on my journey to eventually joining Wise along the way.
Yeah. And what was it that attracted you to Wise?
So my past roles, I think that there's still some areas of the financial services industries that are poorly incentivized, which creates some bad behavior, right? And it's a very much like eat what you catch industry in some places. And there's really this culture of, as I said before, it's like, you want to charge as much as possible to your clients to make as much money as possible sort of thing. When I moved to London, I heard about Wise for the first time, and Wise had a great reputation for the culture that they had there. And like culture means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But one aspect of the culture I really liked was like this cohesive dedication to the mission.
Yeah.
This mission of like building, cheap, transparent, convenient payments for people. And the other aspect, which is like a really important part of the culture at Wise, is this culture of autonomy. And I think what Wise really does is that it empowers people that work there to focus their efforts on things that they think will be impactful. And that was just like a really, really big carrot for me to follow. It kind of led me eventually to join Wise. I knew a few people that had already worked there who sort of extended those same views.
I think one of the hardest roles that I ever recruit for is the country manager or as country manager for an international fintech business. I think first of all, just because the role itself is, it literally is a blue-eyed unicorn. There are so many different facets that this person has to be across, that they have to be competent and be able to execute. And whether that's sales, marketing, recruitment, operations, technology, you kind of got to be across it all. But then the other thing is just the time zone difference and the kind of lack of proximity, where you got a problem, you ain't got somebody next to you, you got to wait for 8 hours, and usually your meetings are at 9 p.m. on a Friday night, 4 a.m. on a Tuesday morning.
Yeah,
and then you got to 8 a.m. You're
that
back
can be
at
the
work
case.
doing your Aussie day. What have you found have been, I guess, one, the kind of challenges in the country manager role, but two, the things that you have really given you energy that you go, this gets me out of bed in the morning.
So we have the added complexity in Australia of being prudentially regulated as well. So we're in.
So last time Wise were on the show was when you got the license.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that creates an extra kind of overhead for us, or for the country manager in terms of like accountability and responsibility. How do I sort of get inspiration, I guess, or
Yeah, look, I think it's a tough gig, right? Like it's like, and it is like you got to be energized, you got to be focused. There's a lot of, particularly with the regulatory stuff as well, dealing with regulators isn't easy, and it's not to suggest that they're intentionally difficult, but it's just another layer of complexity that comes with the role. And particularly in fintech, right, you're chartering uncharted waters where the regulators don't have the answer, and they're often dependent on you to give them that guidance as well.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I sleep pretty well at night because I know that I can honestly say more than, particularly more than a lot of the banks that we compete with, that we are generally trying to do right by the customer. And I think that ultimately regulators respond to that, and they're appreciative of that. The fact that no matter what, we are trying to do right by the customer. We're trying to empower them to make good financial decisions. I think inspiration's kind of hard to manufacture artificially, but I also am very fortunate to work with a product that I really believe in, right? I think about the impact that, I don't want to have delusions of grandeur, it's a financial product, but we're not just moving money or numbers on a screen. We're enabling families to send money home to loved ones. We're supporting small businesses to expand globally. We're facilitating international trade, and we're breaking down financial barriers, trying to connect people and businesses across borders. So, we're empowering people in developing countries, giving them access to affordable, reliable financial services. So all these things are pretty helpful to keep the motivation and keep the inspiration. I like the fact that we work with a product that has utility. It's useful to people, and it's helpful. And some of the challenges that come with that around time zones and dealing with regulators, that's also kind of part of the fun as well. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to work with many different teams in different parts of the world that can all bring context that they have from, that I wouldn't otherwise get exposure to because they're in a different market working with different regulators and different people. And, we are in an industry which is super outdated, and lots of the regulation that governs us was put in place 30, 40 years ago and hasn't changed since. And we all know how fast the technology industry and the financial industry changes, especially lately with challenger banks and all these sorts of things. So that's kind of fun, right? Being a thought leader with regulators and helping sort of guide policy decisions and regulation, hopefully in a place which is useful to Aussie consumers and businesses.
Now, I want to double click on the culture at Wise. you used the word before, cohesion. I think it's a really good word to, it's certainly, I'd say, is reflective of my experience in dealing with Wise as a customer, service provider, and just kind of within my network, people who've worked within the organization. I think one of the things that I think Wise has done does exceptionally well is, the mission that you have, then it permeates all the way through, even as far as remuneration structures, where, people are incentivized for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons. What have been the things for the Wise culture that have stood out to you, that have kept you there for such a long time, and are the kind of, you think, the kind of main attractive components for anybody coming into the business?
Yeah, so I sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think there's like two aspects that are really important. One, as you said, is this like cohesion around the mission. Money without borders, instant, convenient, transparent, and eventually free. That's something that like really people that work here live and breathe, and the tone and it's certainly the tone that's set from the top. Like Kristo genuinely wants, our global CEO and founder genuinely wants it to be eventually free. And, it should be as easy as sending an email to make a payment somewhere. So that's a big component. Another is like the complexity of the challenge that we work on. People join Wise because they want to solve interesting problems. And like, this is a very interesting and super tough problem to try and solve. And that's why we, I think, attract and retain a lot of talent. There's an interesting problem to solve, and you're empowered to go and solve it the way that you think is best to solve it. And so there's that autonomous aspect, and you have a lot of autonomy in the roles at Wise to sort of pick and choose your path.
No, it's a highly competitive space that you're in. Fintech itself is, a unique environment. Startups are tough, but fintech is even tougher because you've got regulatory compliance kind of boundaries that mean that you're kind of limited in how you can actually approach and solve problems. And also, the kind of, the corner cutting that you might see in some other types of businesses, could see people end up in jail, right, in fintech. How do you assess the right people who kind of have that capability to work in fast-moving, high-growth business that's continually evolving with the added kind of, challenge of compliance, and then kind of also have the values and principles around, hey, this is tough, I'm under a lot of pressure, but I'm not going to cut corners, and I'm not going to cheat, and I'm not going to, kind of try and rip people off. We got to do this the right way. Because look, as an observer, I think the thing that I admire most about Wise has been their commitment, methodical, structured approach to solving this problem, where they've invested a lot of money and they haven't cut corners, and they've really kind of set the groundwork, for others to benefit as well, right? Like with the license that you got here in Australia, perfect example, first ever license of its type. What are the qualities then that you look for people who are going to actually perform and thrive in this uniquely complex and difficult environment?
There's a pretty natural progression as a fintech business through like the early sort of startup, scrappier stages to, I guess, a more mature organization from a risk and compliance perspective. And we're no outlier in that. We've definitely been through that journey as well. Like I think it's fair to say that like in the earlier years of Wise, we were probably a little cheekier than maybe we should have been, or not we should have been. We were pretty cheeky and pushed the envelope a little bit from a regulatory standpoint. Like that's kind of necessary to shine a light on something and to advocate for change, which was really required in the industry. I guess like as we've grown and become more systemically important, and also the way we're trying to solve the problem by plugging ourselves directly into payment rails and getting accounts with central banks around the world, is you kind of have to work more within the bounds of the regulation, right? And we can't be seen to be cutting corners. And from a governance and a compliance and risk perspective, we have to make sure that we're thorough, because we have a seat at the table now. We're sort of playing with the big boys, and we need to do it properly. And then I guess that progression of the business through that journey also just organically attracts different people to work at the business as well. And I think like probably the typical profile of someone that joined Wise 10 years ago might be slightly different to the typical profile. And that's based on a few things. Sometimes it's the business and often it's just like the aspirations of the people that are joining as well. It's a really, really hard thing to assess for when we're recruiting. Like there's a couple of key characteristics that I think like probably every business would say that they look for, but certainly Wise does. We want people that are like very curious. You know, they don't just want to accept that something is the way it is, but they want to understand why it is the way it is and if that's still the best way for it to be at the time. And we really want people to be super hands-on. Like you really take ownership of the problems that you're working on and get your hands dirty and be a doer. Sort of speaking earlier about the culture of autonomy at Wise and picking and choosing your own path, that also means that you have to get your hands dirty and you have to do the work and be curious about problem that you're solving and what the best way to solve it is. So I guess these are all considerations when we're hiring. I think like naturally based on the stage we're at of maturity and the regulatory overhead we have. I think, by the way, we're probably the most regulated business in the world. I said and if not today, we certainly will be at some stage. We are extremely reliant on the licenses that we have in different markets, and we are licensed to operate in all the markets that we have. And that means adhering to the regulatory environments of those specific markets. And that creates a huge, huge challenge. And so I think that just the knowledge of that when people are, want to come and work at Wise, if they are applying for a role in the knowledge that we are extremely, tightly regulated, and they're willing to take on that challenge, I think that's like already a good leading indicator that they're in the right spot.
Yeah. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess, fintech in Australia as an industry. Tristan, you've experienced the European market, kind of London, recognized as maybe the birthplace of fintech. What do you think Australia does well, and what do you think we can do better as we look to navigate, what I would say is kind of fintech 2.0, and I think Wise is a perfect example of what fintech 2.0 is. It's not just kind of regulatory arbitrage or, kind of fixing a front end. It's completely reinventing the products, the way we engage with those products and the infrastructure behind how that's delivered, which is way more complex than kind of building a nice little front end UX or whatever that might be. What's your sense as to kind of where Australia's at?
Australia has a budding fintech industry. I think that there's some really, really cool and interesting solutions coming to market and a lot of cool different, problems being solved. I think generally the environment in Australia is very enabling and supportive of those things. I think there's definitely some things that Australia doesn't do very well. So obviously Wise is trying to compete from an infrastructure perspective, with the correspondence system, as I mentioned earlier. That's, as you said, it's not something that you can do with some small seed capital and a couple of laptops. It involves a lot of investment, and it's a long, long journey to get different licenses and things like that. We might work on a license for 2 years before we get it. So it's a bit more of a long-term view. I think that, for me, what does Australia not do well? Competition is by far the biggest driver of innovation. And I think the most impactful thing we could do as a nation to sort of fan the flames of competition, specifically in our industry and cross-border payments and international banking, is enforce fee transparency. And it's something that Australia lags behind the rest of the world. We've seen really great initiatives come to market in Europe and the UK in terms of enforcing banks to disclose FX markups and transparency in the fees they charge for various financial services. And that's just not the case in Australia, and banks aren't required to be transparent about how they charge for things. I think that Australian consumers are smart, and they'll gravitate towards services that are the best for them and the cheapest for them when they know what they're paying for. And if that means gravitating towards services like ours or other, innovative financial technology startups in the short term, inevitably it's going to mean that banks who have the biggest human and financial capital behind them, they will innovate as well. And ultimately that'll be good for, the industry and the landscape in Australia. And so, it's one thing that we bang the drum about a lot, but I just can't understand why Australian policymakers and regulators haven't done more to enforce transparency in Australia, because it would be a flick of a switch. It would have immeasurable beneficial impacts on for Australians, and if they did it like overnight. So I think that's one area that we could be better at, and there's some learnings.
And in terms of, I guess, kind of the future of fintech, what's got you excited? There's a lot of stuff going on. The noise around crypto is back. We're kind of, we've got AI, there's quantum computing around the corner. And when you cut through all the noise, what is the thing that's got you excited about this year ahead?
I think, one thing that I try not to do is spread myself and our teams too thinly across areas that are not like sort of core to the problems that we're trying to solve. We're not trying to be a super app and jack of all trades. I think cross-border payments is obviously the area that we are interested in. It's a huge problem to solve, and we're nowhere near fully solving it yet. And there's a long roadmap ahead. I'm really excited about some of the things that we're doing at Wise. I think I'm excited about some increased competition in Australia. So if some of our competitors coming to market, I actually think that's a really good thing for Australia, and it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds, particularly because as an industry, the more people we have collectively yelling the same things about the same structural problems in Australia, the more chance we have of pushing for change. So there's some opportunities for us to collaborate there. At Wise, I'm really excited about our platform partnerships. We've spent a number of years building out the infrastructure to be able to support bigger financial institutions and help them improve their cross-border and multi-currency payment offerings.
It should be noted as well, I don't think we touched on this, but Upbank were one of your very first customers in the partnership space.
Yeah, exactly. One thing that we're observing in Australia is that, so Australia is a unique market, obviously dominated by a few big banks, and people in Australia generally join a bank when they're pretty young and stick with that bank for their whole life. There's this real ingrained customer inertia with the financial services. But I think that more and more we're seeing Australians be more mindful that there are other financial services that can cater for specific things that they want to do, right? And yes, you might have your bank for credit and lending, but for instance, from a Wise perspective, if you want to send a payment to someone somewhere else in the world, there's a much better way to do that through your bank. And we're seeing people be more open to that, which is really good, and it's a really positive thing. And so Upbank's an example of where we have made our infrastructure available to a financial institution so that they can offer their own customers the ability to send an instant payment somewhere else in the world across our rails, but without leaving the Up app, which is really cool. There's a few of those in the pipeline, I think, and hopefully we start to gain a bit of momentum in the Aussie market, which has been pretty stubborn. The banks have been pretty stubborn in accepting that all right, this might actually be a better experience for our customers, and we don't have to build it all ourselves. We can build it on top of yours. Sorry.
Yeah, you go.
I was just going to say, just to quickly wrap up that thought, we mentioned Australia's geographical location and outbound remittance. Wise is working on direct integrations in a number of different Asian markets at the moment. And when we connect up to those instant schemes, it's going to make a really cool experience for Australian customers trying to send money to those places. So that will be pretty cool to watch unfold.
Now, I can't help but mention this, and I'm sure all of our listeners have seen the ads. They have been everywhere. And my kind of own experience with, Wise is, whenever I'm talking to people about the business, the product, it's almost ubiquitous what the response that I'll get. And it's real simple, and it's great product. Use it all the time. When do you think you're going to start to see this? Because I think there is a bit more of a kind of groundswell of momentum behind the fees and kind of really pushing this change. When do you think we kind of might start to see there being some real serious action taken and kind of things starting to move in favor of the consumer?
So I think we've already started to see some of those changes, but in terms of policy change and what regulators can do, I mean, how long's a piece of string? I can't really put a date on that one.
I mean, it's how many times has the same policy submission kind of gone in?
Exactly.
We wanted with different title but same subject.
Exactly. We've been asking for change for many years, and even when something gets put on the agenda, it generally gets delayed or pushed back. But anyway, that's a side note. I mean, like Wise's growth, 70% of our customer acquisition is still word of mouth, which is really cool, right? We want to invest.
Wow.
We're a low margin business. We want to invest back into the product and let people talk about it and let their friends and family know how great the product is, and hopefully that will bring them to use us. You've seen a bit of marketing. It's a bit of a new experiment for us. We call it sort of top of funnel marketing, and the intention of that is like brand recognition is obviously important just for educating customers that there's other solutions out there. It's also really important in Australia because one of the challenges that all fintechs face, I think, is this idea of trust. And we always get asked, "Oh, how can we trust you? Is this fintech a scam or something like that?" And so I think like one of the things we're trying to get across to customers is like we're a big international player. We do this branding and marketing to let you know that we are here and we're an alternative solution, and we are regulated the same as big banks are. We're an ADI. Get that in the mindset a little bit so people understand, all right, if they're doing, these adverts during the test series for the cricket, then they must be a legitimate financial service.
And I tell you what a series that was, eh?
You must have
got way more eyeballs than you were expecting on those ads.
Yeah, that was great. Although none of the tests went for 5 days, so well, I think one did.
Yeah, but you got record viewership. I think certainly from my perspective, when I put the Boxing Day test on, it's on in the background, and this year I couldn't take my eyes off the things. I was watching every over.
Me too. Yeah. And look, also like, India is a huge remittance corridor from Australia. There's a huge Indian diaspora here in Australia, sending money home. And so, it was a good chance to raise some awareness, I guess, with that demographic.
Well, Tristan, it's been fantastic to have you on. I'm really glad I just got to share kind of a bit in depth, the level of substance, that's kind of gone into building this business over the last decade. And the kind of, I think you kind of touched on this just before, right? It's like it really legitimizes the industry and, kind of shows the maturity of the industry and how rapidly it's evolved, particularly, I think, over this last few years, where it's been very much kind of heads down and just get on with it and just kind of fix problems and let's move into the future. So it's been fantastic to share kind of your journey and kind of the the insights from Wise. We get some amazing talent listening to this podcast who I'm sure would be very interested in finding out about careers at the business. Where can people go and find out about Wise careers?
So best place is to just look on our jobs website. So jobs.wise.com, and that's where we list all the openings. So keep an eye out and reach out if something you feel you're a good fit for something. Love to hear from everyone.
We're also listened to it in over 40 countries, believe it or not. So I'm sure there'll be many people who listening to this want to send money overseas. If they haven't already downloaded the Wise app, where do they need to go?
Just into the App Store or the Google Store. We're in both, and you can just download the Wise app and you can sign up pretty quickly and seamlessly. And feel free to give any feedback if you think there's areas where it could be better. Always open to customer feedback on the sign up and verification process. But yeah, it's a quick sign up. You can do it straight through the app.
Brilliant. Well, folks, thanks so much for joining me. If you're new to the show, make sure you follow us on your favorite podcast player or subscribe on YouTube, Fintech Chatter TV. If you're coming back, thanks so much for your support. It really means a lot to me, and it really helps me bring on great guests like Tristan. Until the next episode, keep well.